Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College, coming to you with part 2 of the biology of psychology. And today we'll be taking up the various brain structures and how they participate in our psychology. And so here we go. Once again, let me make sure. Okay, so we're going to be starting with looking at structures that would be considered part of the brainstem, this area that begins where our spine comes in our skull here and on up until the mid area of the brain. Notice that it has many automatic survival related functions. Much of what it does requires no conscious thought on our part, and much of this is necessary for our survival. So let's look at a few of the structures there. The first one is the medulla. Okay, and here this is this whole area here, and this regulates many survival related reflexes, things like heartbeat, breathing, choking and coughing reflex. And vital for our survival, if this area is severely damaged, the ultimate result is death. Next, we have the pons. This is this sort of a bulging area here. And pons is actually the Latin word for bridge. In this case, it is a bridge for sensory signals from our body, touch and that sort of thing from our body as it moves into the rest of the brain, and also movement signals also from the brain to the body. And here, the signals cross from one side to the other such that the left side of our brain controls the movement of the right side of the body and so forth. The pons is also involved in sleep and dreaming. It's the area of our brain that blocks the movement signals that are occurring when we're dreaming so that we're not actually acting out physically our dreams. It's also involved with dreaming, sending stimulation to higher parts of the brain that might stimulate a variety of emotions, memories, and thoughts that seem to be kind of at random. Next, we have the thalamus. A lot of times they'll call this the brain's sensory router. So sensory information, touch, hot, cold, and so forth, feeling from the body, arrives here at the thalamus. And also vision and hearing and so forth all pass through here. And then they are routed to, these signals are routed to the part of the brain that processes that specific type of information. So I kind of like to think of it as the brain's post office. All the sensory information goes in here, and then once it's there, it's sent out to its ultimate destination where it's finally processed in detail, other areas of the brain. We next have the reticular formation, and this is a network of neurons throughout the entire brainstem. And this is involved with then our arousal alertness. So in animal experiments, when they disabled this structure, animals would simply go into sort of a coma-like state, kind of lose consciousness. On the other hand, when this was stimulated in animal research, they found that a sleeping cat would instantly become awake, and no yawning, no stretching, just instant transition from asleep to awake. So this is the area of our brain that helps rouse us to alertness when we're sleeping and need to wake up, and accounts for just how activated we are to some extent. Then we have the cerebellum. And so this is very important for our coordination and balance. If it's damaged, we may have problems with these type of abilities, and the person might have difficulty with coordination. They might still be able to move, but their movements would be jerky and imprecise because this area of the brain is comparing how much you intend to move with how much you actually move. if damaged, also balance problems may result. The person might be able to walk, but it might be like somebody who's very drunk. And as a matter of fact, this is one of the first parts of the brain that is affected when you drink alcohol. So that kind of matches up. This is also important for motor memory. So when we learn a new movement skill, then this is the area of the brain that is necessary to lock in that new motor pattern. Classical conditioning requires this area of the brain as well. Now, classical conditioning is when we learn to associate one event which is followed by another immediately. So if every time I said your name, there was this blinding flash of light, which would cause you to blink, classical conditioning would eventually cause you to blink whenever I said your name, even if there wasn't the flash of light. Get the idea? Notice this part of the brain has to be intact in order to develop those associations. The basal ganglia is sort of in between that brainstem area and the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain. And so this is important in terms of movement ability. It receives information from the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of our brain, and input is the output then is sent to movement centers in the brainstem. So one of the things that goes on with the basal ganglia, which is actually a bunch of structures, is selecting the correct movement pattern. So if a ball is coming towards us, selecting for the catching sort of mode rather than throwing a ball mode is part of what the basal ganglia will be doing. Another area of the basal ganglia is involved with postural control as well. And so when damaged, you might see posture problems. Okay. Can't account for the speaking problems here, but anyways, okay, moving on. So now we have a look at the limbic system. Again, numerous structures, and this borders that brainstem and the cerebral cortex once again, sort of in between structures. This accounts is participating in producing emotions like fear, anger, which might lead to aggression. Also accounts for drives like hunger and thirst, is involved with memory. So we'll be looking at three structures here of numerous ones: the hippocampus, amygdala, hypothalamus, looking at one at a time. So first of all, the amygdala. So this is the area they found associated with sort of survival-related emotions, fear and anger. And they say survival-related? Yeah, fear would cause you to avoid things that might endanger your survival, and anger might cause you to protect yourself or you're young. So pretty important with those emotional responses. And also the bodily responses that go along with those particular emotions. In fact, we may not consciously feel the emotion, but we might have the bodily response going on even when we're not aware of the emotion. So in studying this, again, they found in cats, when some areas of this amygdala was stimulated, the cat would go into attack mode immediately. And when other areas of it were stimulated, the cat would become completely passive and would not fight back for anything, would not attack a mouse that it normally would. So you notice there's kind of some accelerator and brakes kind of action there, if you will. The amygdala is also necessary for normal emotional perception. If damaged, the person may simply lack awareness of their own emotional state or that of others. They may not be able to tell when other people are angry or sad and so forth. And the amygdala also is important in signaling the rest of our brain to store lots of information about emotional producing sort of situations. So if we have a traumatic or an exciting event, this part of the brain is going to tell the rest to store lots of information about that important event. Then we move to the hypothalamus. Hypo means below, and as you can see in the illustration here, this is the thalamus found below it. Hypothalamus is not very large, but it has many, many functions that it participates in. For one thing, it's involved with enabling us to maintain bodily homeostasis. In other words, to keep various bodily functions within the proper range, to keep our blood pressure within the proper range, to keep our body temperature within the right range, and so forth. It's also the portion of the brain that is very much instrumental in producing what we call drives. So when we're lacking something that we need physically, this is going to produce a tension to correct that state. So for example, if we don't have enough liquid in our bloodstream, this area of the brain is going to produce the drive of thirst. And it's going to drive us to drink some kind of liquid and remedy that situation. So hunger drive, thirst drive, sex drive. So it's also involved in the sleep and wake cycle as well. We'll get into more of that when we get into chapter 3 on consciousness. And it participates in the fight or flight response. And specifically, if we feel threatened, the hypothalamus is going to release a substance that stimulates the pituitary gland, which in turn submits a hormone that stimulates the adrenal glands to produce epinephrine, adrenaline. So you could say in this sense, it links the brain with the endocrine system. And really, when it comes right back to it, the endocrine system also links back to the brain. So we have a loop. And with that fight or flight syndrome, that adrenaline that is produced eventually also affects the functioning of the brain itself. So we actually have a feedback loop here. Now, in some species, they've also found that some instinctive animal behaviors were also stimulated by the activity of the hypothalamus. For example, certain animals that have specific mating behaviors or nest building behaviors under certain circumstances, the hypothalamus triggers these behaviors. They also discovered reward centers in this area as well. And Olds and Milner, years ago, when actually trying to undertake studies of other parts of the brain, misimplanted the electrode into the rat's hypothalamus. And they found something very strange about the rat's behavior. When that area had been previously stimulated, this pleasure or reward center, as they called it, the rat would cross an electrified grid that it wouldn't cross for food if it was starving, in order to get another jolt to that reward center. The rat would press a lever until it fell down exhausted, nearly dying from exhaustion, just to get another jolt to that reward center. So very powerful effects, the activity of that area. They've also found in humans other similar areas. Think about that in terms of human behavior. What's the rat's behavior similar to? If you think about it a bit, it almost sounds like what? Addictive behavior. The person that has a drug addiction might take chances that they wouldn't take to get food even if they were starving, just to get more of the drug. Or they might work themselves to exhaustion, again, simply to get another jolt of that drug. And so it's been suggested that maybe one of the roots of addiction for some people are a reward deficiency syndrome. And these areas of the brain are not producing their effects normally, yet when recreational drugs are ingested, this produces that activity, and therefore the person becomes addicted to the drug and keeps taking it. By the way, should mention they learned that dopamine was one of the primary neurotransmitters involved with this whole reward system. And interestingly, drugs that people get addicted to often are those that stimulate um, significant releases of dopamine. So seems to be parallels there. As they looked at humans, they found that there are additional reward centers for eating, drinking, sex, all kinds of things. Human brain is a little more complex. So while we're at this, I want to also bring you something that's not in the textbook while we're talking about these neural circuits that have to do with rewards for various types of activity. I want to have you look at the various what were called affective neural circuits that had been discovered within the brain. This was outlined by Jake Panksepp in 1994 as he summarized all of the research regarding these affective neural circuits. And so wanted to expose you to the list of them that he identified. And later on in the course, we'll come back to that when we talk about motivation and emotion, because these are going to be very influential when it comes to that. But just to make you aware of them, just a quick overview. And by the way, these neural circuits can involve numerous brain structures. So here we're not looking at a brain structure, but a series of brain structures working together to produce these affective, motivational, or emotional responses. So one is what he called the seeking or desire system. This is that system actually that we were looking at here. And so when we have a particular goal and we move towards that, dopamine is released, which has a pleasing, pleasurable effect, and also has the effect of motivating us to continue moving towards that goal. This is also the system that becomes active when we have interest or curiosity. Then the rage anger system, and that's kind of self-explanatory. So anger, anywhere from mild irritation to total outright rage. Um, this, as we saw earlier, would involve the amygdala as well as other brain structures. And then we have the fear and anxiety system as well. That one also involving the amygdala that we saw earlier. I guess that's pretty self-explanatory. The lust system, okay, so this one produces sexual desire when active, and also produces satisfaction when sexual activity is engaged in. Then the care or maternal nurturance system. This system is one that stimulates and motivates taking care of others, particularly those that are our young or our family, but turns out could be friends or other people we're close with. So this also is important for the bonding and forming of close relationships. And then we have this grief circuit. And this has also been known as a separation distress system. So this is activated whenever we are separated from those that are important to us, or we lose something very important. And for that matter, we now know this even can be activated when maybe we find that we've lost an important goal in our life that seems to become, not possible. And then here's an interesting one, the play system. And so this stimulates engaging in rough and tumble play, running around and wrestling and rolling on the ground with others. And it's a social system. It urges us to physically engage with other people. So that's really important for kids growing up so that they play and they learn how to interact with other kids. But even with us adults, it can be advantageous to activate that system so we can engage in some relaxing, fun play with others, even as adults. So if you find that interesting, you can go to this web address that I've listed here, and it'll give you more information about those systems. And we'll also come back to them later when we're taking up the topic of motivation and emotions. But do know this does start right there in the brain. So next we go to another limbic system structure. This is the hippocampus. And this is bordering, again, the outer layer of the brain, the cerebral cortex. The hippocampus is necessary for storing new memories, memories of events that have occurred that we've experienced, as well as storing new information and new facts. The hippocampus is also responsible for the development of cognitive maps, mental maps. So, if you've been on the college campus, for any length of time, you have formed a mental map of how the campus is set up, at least the parts that you're familiar with, right? And, if you're in the classroom, you probably know where the parking lot would be from where you're at and which way to go if you want to go to the library or to building K or whatever it might be. And so you've got that mental map there. That's kind of important. And does this have to do with personal goals? Do we have mental maps of personal goals that we have? Some of us would say yes. Is it this part of the brain that's involved? I'm not sure, but it would be interesting to find out. Now, if the hippocampus is severely damaged, then the person experiences anterograde amnesia. In other words, they can still remember all the stuff that they knew before the damage to their hippocampus, but they can't form new memories in terms of they can't learn new facts. They can't remember events that have happened after the damage to this area of the brain. The hippocampus also is one of the first parts of the brain to begin to degenerate when people develop Alzheimer's disease. And interestingly, one of the first signs of Alzheimer's is memory problems and not being able to learn new information, very consistent with what we saw here. Okay, so now we go to the cerebral cortex. So this is that whole outer layer of the brain. And notice that we have just millions and millions of interconnected neurons here. The cerebral cortex is divided into left and right cerebral hemispheres, and much of the control of our behavior is controlled there. And also processing of information is one of its specialties. Although I'll have to say these other parts of the brain we already looked at do a tremendous amount of information processing. And in some ways, those more primitive parts of the brain that we saw previously may control our behavior to a great extent unless we're consciously making an effort to change that behavior. So anyways, this diagram here is a nice one for review. So that's a good one to come back to. You should have something similar in your textbook as well. But let's go into detail in the cerebral cortex. So first of all, each hemisphere can be divided into 4 different areas, 4 different lobes. Each of these lobes has a different function in terms of sensation or movement. I should have the word movement up here too. Okay, so the occipital lobe is the one way in the back here. And this is where our visual cortex is. This is the area that begins processing information that's sent to it from our eyes. The parietal lobe, right in front of that occipital lobe and near the top of our skull, contains our sensory cortex. So this processes information that it received from our body in terms of touch and hot and cold pain. The temporal lobe, found kind of around the ears area, contains our auditory cortex. So this part of our brain is going to process auditory sound information. And finally, then we have our frontal cortex. And here at the back of that frontal lobe here, we have then the motor cortex that stimulates movement in various parts of our body. So each of these lobes has a sensation or motor function. Now, when we have a look at the visual cortex, notice here as a person is looking at faces, here's the visual cortex. In an MRI, you see activity here in the visual cortex as the person is looking at that. Did I say occipital lobe back there? Hopefully so. Okay. Now here we have an indication of where the auditory cortex is located in your temporal lobe. Interesting little fact. When people who have auditory hallucinations, they hear things that aren't really there. Like they might hear voices of people speaking. There's actually nobody speaking. What they found is when they were having these auditory hallucinations, this area, auditory cortex, was active as if they were actually hearing real sounds. Well, is it any wonder that many of those people are convinced that those hallucination voices are real? In fact, as far as brain activity, it's pretty much identical to hearing an actual sound. Imagine how confusing that must be. Okay, now we have the motor and sensory cortex. So the motor cortex is found at the back of that frontal lobe, shown here in red. This controls the voluntary movements of our body. And as you can see in this cutaway view, this is indicating what areas of our body are stimulated by neurons in various parts of this motor cortex. Now, what you'll also notice, and by the way, you don't have these body parts in your head. I thought that when I took psychology first, I was freaked out for a few weeks. Then I found out, no, what this actually indicates is, what area of the body is controlled by what area of the motor cortex. But notice a tremendous amount of that motor cortex is devoted to controlling the muscles of the face and lips and jaw, the hand and fingers, not so much to controlling, say, the hip or the arm. And you say, well, why is that so out of proportion? Well, we have many tiny muscles that require fine motor coordination in our lips and face in order to enable us to speak. And same thing with our fingers. Many small muscles have to be coordinated in order to do various motor skills with our fingers. And so it takes lots of neurons to produce those very precise movements, but not so many neurons to control very simple movements like you might have of your hip or your arm. On the right side, we also see the sensory cortex that's shown in this picture in the purple. That is found in the parietal lobe, right behind the motor cortex. This is the area of the brain that receives sensory information from our body, touch and pressure, heat and cold, pain. And notice again, we have a very similar setup. And why? Well, we need a lot of feedback from these areas of our body in order to coordinate the movements properly. And if you don't believe that, think about if you've been to the dentist and they've numbed your mouth and you're trying to speak and you're slurring and you're slobbering as you try to drink your soda. Yeah, you need the feedback there to coordinate those muscles. Or think about trying to pick up a tiny washer off of the floor while wearing heavy gloves. It's so hard to do because you can't feel it. Take the gloves off and it becomes easy because, yeah, now you can feel it. So the feedback is necessary. Okay. Now we move on to having a look at association areas of the cerebral cortex. So association areas are those that are not devoted to sensation or movement. These areas generally enable then our higher mental functions, thinking and calculating and making decisions, and perception, trying to figure out what different things mean and so on. What we find also is animals that we consider to be more intelligent tend to have more association areas available for themselves to work with. Humans have the most of all. So again, these association areas differ from one area of the brain to another. So let's just have a look at a few. We have in the frontal cortex numerous association areas that are really important. And we first began learning of this when they studied Phineas Gage back in the 1800s. I say we, not me personally, I'm not that old. I know you guys think I am, but scientists, okay. So Phineas Gage had this metal implement go through his frontal cortex, damaged it severely, and he exhibited many changes in his abilities as a result. He no longer was able to plan ahead effectively. His judgment was poor. He couldn't make good decisions anymore. He lost his moral compass. Previously, he had been a really nice guy and helpful. Now he was just mean and just went around attacking people for no reason. Just totally lost his moral sense. And he also lost his impulse control, so he couldn't control his behavior and restrain himself from doing things, even if he knew it wasn't the thing to do. And some aspects of his personality changed significantly. While he was previously a very agreeable person, afterwards he became very disagreeable and argumentative. And so these kind of functions we have learned are to a great extent regulated by this frontal cortex. Now, parietal lobes, these areas of the cerebral cortex are involved in mathematical reasoning, how we work math problems. Spatial reasoning as well. Spatial reasoning is now taking three-dimensional objects and figuring out how to arrange them, things like that. How to arrange the furniture in the living room, or how to arrange things so that they'll fit in a box, that's kind of stuff. And then your right temporal lobe, there is an area that is important for facial recognition. If that's damaged, people may be able to see other people's faces, but not tell one person from another or recognize who they are. And that's just some examples of association areas. There are many, and really many areas that we're not even sure what they do exactly. There are also association areas for language. And by the way, our textbook has done this in different chapters. You might just take notes here. If a person has a language problem, this is referred to as having an aphasia. And the aphasia may be tracked to a particular area of the brain. For example, Broca's area, found here in the frontal cortex, this controls the speech muscles by sending information to the motor cortex. So if Broca's area is damaged, the person then has Broca's aphasia. And what problem will they have? They won't be able to control those speech muscles, so they may be completely unable to enunciate any speech sounds, or maybe they can sort of do so, but there is what, some lisp, or it's just mumbling, that sort of thing, right? So that's the kind of thing we would see with Brokaw's aphasia. They're not able to produce the speech sounds correctly. Wernicke's area is back here in the temporal lobe. Sorry, I'm just looking and checking my watch here. Okay, and Wernicke's area, it says interprets auditory code. Let's interpret that. So what that means is it takes the sounds of language and extracts the meaning of that from those sounds. Wernicke's area is also involved in constructing meaningful sentences. So if damaged, Wernicke's aphasia might involve an inability to understand what others are telling them. It might involve also speech which doesn't make sense to anybody else. The words are all out of order, or the endings of the words are not correct, so it just doesn't make sense. Okay, Wernicke's aphasia. Now, what we're going to see is that in many cases, there is integration between areas of the brain. In other words, various brain areas work together to accomplish tasks. They cooperate, if you will. And we can see that indicated here. A person is hearing words. And so their auditory cortex is receiving and processing the signals for that sound. It's been sent off then to Wernicke's area, so we can then decode what those words actually mean, what those sounds of language actually mean. Or here, a person is seeing words, they're reading, okay? And so what do we have here? The visual cortex is first decoding those visual signals from our eyes and sending it on to the angular gyrus. Oh, I didn't tell you about the angular gyrus. Okay, so what does it do? Let's go back here. There it is. Angular gyrus, there it is. Says transforms visual representations into an auditory code. So what do we mean here? Well, if you're seeing words on the page, that's your visual representation, right? So angular gyrus is going to take that visual word on the page, turn it into the sounds of language. Hey, have you ever noticed that when you're reading something, you have that voice in your head that's saying the words? Yeah, that's what this angular gyrus is responsible for. Now, we might further say, well, if you're reading for understanding, then Wernicke's area has to get involved and figure out, well, just what do those words mean that we have transformed those letters into. And of course, if we're speaking words, then Brokaw's area is cooperating with motor cortex to produce the sounds of speech. So many activities that we do, not just language, but many others, require the cooperation of a wide variety of brain areas. I want to show you something, though, that is kind of the opposite. So when I flip to the next slide, I want you to out loud read the words as fast as you can, top to bottom, and I'll read them too. You race me and see if you can beat me to the last one. Are you ready? See if you can beat the instructor. Okay, read the words top to bottom. Ready, go. Blue, green, red, yellow, red, orange, green, brown, yellow, purple, red. Did you win? Yeah, you probably did. I'm not a very fast talker. There's certain limits to it. But that was pretty easy, right? I mean, that's not hard if you can read. So on the next one, would you name the color of the boxes from top to bottom? They're not as clear as they should be, but just, call it whatever it's kind of close to. And once again, why don't you race me and see if you can win, all right? Do it out loud so that you can see. Uh-oh. Blue, pink, yellow, blue, gray, green, brown. white, orange. Oh, I'll bet you really beat me that time. So, but that's not too hard. If they were clear, it would be really easy, right? So that's not hard. Now, the next one, what I want you to do is I want you to say the color of the letters for each word, top to bottom. Do not read what the letters spell. Do not say the word that the letters spell. Only say the color that the letters are. Okay, and this time I'm not going to say anything because this one is going to be a little more challenging. So are you ready, top to bottom? I'll just do it in my head while you do it out loud. You ready? Go. Okay. Did you get to the bottom? Not quite so easy, right? Now, why is that hard? Now, think about it. Do you know how to, don't you know your colors? Should be easy, right? In fact, it's difficult for us because we now have a couple areas of our brain that are actually competing against each other, okay? So we've sort of been taught where we see letters that we're to read the words. And so the areas of our brain that's involved with reading get busy as soon as letters are registered, and that process goes into gear. But that's, in this case, not compatible with the actual colors of the letters. So the area that is identifying colors has a competing response. And so here we have a situation of competition between brain areas, making the task more difficult. And so this is also the case. And by the way, if we give this to kindergarten kids that can't read yet, they'll zip through those colors no problem because, yeah, they don't have that interference. They can't read the words. Well, anyways, this comes across in other ways. For example, maybe you you know you should be studying for an exam, but you really want to play that video game. Yeah, it's much harder to study for that exam when you have this other part of your brain constantly telling you, hey, come on, let's play that video game. Or imagine this one. You know that you really should speak respectfully to someone, but you're really angry at them and you'd rather punch them in the nose. And yeah, how easy is it to then speak with respect? It's really hard because you're competing against that angry urge, right? So there is the opposite brain areas actually competing against each other. Okay, so now let's move on to the brain's ability that we refer to as plasticity. So plasticity, well, it means that what? The brain can be molded, it can be reshaped after damage, that situations it's encountering can influence its development. So here's some examples. The brain's ability to recover from damage. The most striking example I've run across is the effect of the hemispherectomy. Now, hemispherectomy would be the removal of one entire hemisphere of the brain, left or right. Interestingly, if this is done with a very young child, as might have to be done if there were something wrong with it or something, that child will grow up to be as normal as can be. You would not know that they're sort of functioning on half of the brain, if you will. Essentially, what has happened is the rest of their brain has been able to compensate and take over functions that were lost. Now, this ability to recover from damage such as this is with us throughout life, but as we get older, there's less and less. So if anyone your age would receive a hemispherectomy, you would have numerous deficits that you would not be able to fully recover from. But even in old age, people still retain some of this ability. Think of, for example, people who have a loss of some ability after having a stroke. Maybe they have lost their speech, but with time and maybe with some therapy, they may be able to regain some of that speech ability, even though the original area that was involved in their brain has not been has been damaged. And so what we see here is other areas of the brain beginning to step in for the lost functions. The brain is also able to reorganize itself when required. And striking examples, people that had vision and then lost their sight can learn how to read Braille. They run their fingers against those dots on a page. Turns out that their brain is actually routing those touch signals from their fingers to their visual cortex, where words on a page would normally be registering. The brain has rerouted those signals. Same thing when people learn sign language, when they become proficient at it, that information is actually passing through their auditory cortex, where the sounds of words are normally beginning to register. So the brain, again, rerouting those signals. Plasticity also involves the brain being able to adapt to demands that we place on it. And here's a striking example. Back in the days before they had GPS and people had to just navigate their way around by memory, they compared areas of the left hippocampus of male taxi drivers with left hippocampus of non-taxi drivers. Now you say, what's the left hippocampus have to do with this? Well, in males, it turns out there's an area of that left hippocampus that's involved with navigational ability. So what they found, the male taxi drivers had greater development in that area of their left hippocampus than non-taxi drivers. The neurons were more connected there, they were denser. They also found that the more experienced taxi drivers had greater development in that area than less experienced ones. So the brain was adapting to the demands put on it. Now that's good news, because maybe you, for example, have a limited attention span. Well, this would suggest that if you practice focusing your attention, that your ability to do so is going to actually improve as your brain makes the adaptations that you're steering it towards. Neurogenesis is another ability of the brain. This is the ability to produce new neurons. Neurons, genesis, the beginning or creation of something, right? Now, they used to think that we didn't get new neurons, that we only had the few that we were born with, or the many we were born with. But now we know these are created deep within the brain and then move into other brain areas. They also have learned that there are certain things that increase the rate of neurogenesis. They have found that sleep, that exercise, and learning something new all increase the rate of neurogenesis, stimulate the production of new neurons. So now, if you want to have more brain cells, you've got the formula. Get some exercise, get plenty of sleep, learn some new things, and you can actually influence that. Here we come to the topic of lateralization. So here we're going to look at specialty abilities that each side of the brain may have. And first of all, each side of the brain, left and right hemispheres, is normally in constant communication with the other side of the brain, so that each side knows what the other side is doing. And that information passes from one side of the brain to the other over this structure called the corpus callosum. that connects the left and right hemispheres. Now, back in the late 1950s, they found out that people that had severe epilepsy, had severe seizures, could sometimes be relieved of those seizures by severing this connection, this corpus callosum. And so they began to study these split brain patients. Turned out to be very interesting. Whereas you might think they'd be incapacitated, in reality, they seem to be not much different after the surgery than before. They seem to retain their same levels of intelligence and personality. But if you put them in certain situations, then certain changes were evident after this split brain surgery. So we're going to have a look at then a video that shows work being done by Michael Gazzaniga with one of these split brain patients who was known as Joe. And I think there it is. So let me make sure that this is okay. So let's have a look at it.
Information from each side of the body goes to the opposite side of the brain, and many functions are performed half on one side, half on the other. But certain tasks are committed much more to one hemisphere, especially in human beings. The right hemisphere is specialized for spatial judgments, while the left can describe its perceptions in words. Normally, these two specialized halves work together as one.
I know the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere now are working independent of each other, but you don't notice it. Now, you just kind of adapt to it. It doesn't, you don't have any feeling different than it did before.
The corpus callosum, a huge bundle of fibers, connects the two halves of the brain. When it's damaged, in Joe's case through surgery to relieve epilepsy, then it almost seems that there are two separate people sharing a single head.
What we can do is play tricks by putting information into his disconnected, mute, non-talking right hemisphere and watch it produce behaviors. And out of that, we can really see that there is, in fact, a reason to believe that there's all kinds of complex processes going on outside of his conscious awareness of his left half brain. Joe, I'm going to show you some things. I just want you to tell me what you see. And here we go. You ready? Look right at the dot.
Okay.
Right. Okay, you ready? Look right at the dot.
Grapes.
Good. When Joe focuses on a point,
Right at the dot.
everything to the right of the point goes to his left brain, the dominant hemisphere for language and speech.
Look right at the dot.
So we can see here that when we flash a word or a picture,
Great.
Joe is easily able to name it.
Here we go. See it.
Close your eyes and let your left hand do a little work here. Okay, what do you got there?
Pan.
Okay, very good. Now, when a word or a picture falls to the left of a fixation point, that information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. Joe is able to draw the picture with his left hand, the left hand getting its major control from the right half brain. What'd you draw?
Okay.
What'd you see?
Wheel. One side. I don't know where it's on the other.
So even though he can't name it, his left hand is able to draw out the picture of the stimulus of the picture or word that we presented to his right half brain. What did you see?
Hammer.
So just close your eyes and draw with your left hand. Just let it go. Nice, what's that?
Saw.
Yeah. What'd you see?
Hammer.
What'd you draw that for?
I don't know.
What Joe and patients like him, and there are many of them, teaches us is that the mind is made up of a constellation of independent, semi-independent, agents, and that these agents, these processes can carry on a vast number of activities outside of our conscious awareness. Even though that goes on, there's some final stage or some final system, which I happen to think is in the left hemisphere, that pulls all of this information together into a theory. It has to generate a theory to explain all of these independent elements. And so, and that theory becomes our particular theory of ourself and of the world.
From impulses leaving the eyes to a theory of ourself and the world, we're beginning to learn how the cerebral cortex gives us our understanding.
Okay, so let me bring back our outline again, and let's kind of try to make some sense of what you just saw there. It can be a little confusing. So first of all, one thing that I did not mention to you about language areas of the brain, those speech areas in most people are only on the left side of the brain. Okay, so if we take these split brain patients, recognize information can't pass from the left to right hemisphere or vice versa. So if we project an image that is to the left part of the center of their visual field, if they're staring at something with a dot in the middle to the left of that dot, that information will arrive at the visual cortex in their right hemisphere. So the pencil would arrive here. Now, would you say that this person here sees the pencil? And you'd have to say, well, they do. The right side of their brain sees the pencil. Normally, a person would, both sides of their brain would have knowledge of it. But here, only the right side is aware of the pencil. So if we ask this person about what they saw, they will not be able to name the pencil as one of the objects that they saw. Now, why can't they tell us, even though the right side of their brain can see it? The information is unable to pass to the left side of the brain where those speech areas are. Now, on the other hand, if we ask them to draw that, can they draw the object? Yes, they can. And here's the big question: which hand will they have to draw with in order to produce that object? And that would be their left hand, because the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body through another pathway other than this corpus callosum. Okay, so pretty strange, right? Yeah, and in fact, these folks are really interesting. They can, for example, draw a square and a circle simultaneously, no problem. You try to do that, you're gonna have a lot of trouble with that. Okay, so here's, we're in a situation where interference from one part of the brain to the other does not occur as it normally would, but we'd have trouble with that. These folks also, other interesting things, you might find them in the grocery store, one hand putting something into the cart, the other hand taking it out. It seems as if one side of their brain says we need this and the other side says we don't need that. Or one hand buttoning their coat and the other unbuttoning it. It seems that they're of two minds, so to speak, operating independently. Another interesting story about these folks, researcher was doing some other things, and they projected a message to the left of the center of their visual field, of the split brain patient's visual field. The message indicated to get up and leave the room. And so lo and behold, when they encountered that message, the patient did get up and begin to leave the room. And so the researcher said, well, where are you going? What are you doing? And he paused a bit, and then the patient said, well, I don't know. I just got a sudden urge to go get a soda. And so you see what's going on here. Yeah, the right side of their brain saw the message and stimulated the movements to go get up and leave the room. The left side of the brain that can speak didn't know why they were getting up to leave the room. So the left side simply made up something to account for their behavior. And that's why Gazzaniga said, you know, it seems that the left side of our brain is involved with, you know, sort of coming up with the reasons that we're doing things and explanation for our behaviors. Seems to be one of its jobs. Might also mention that, well, let's just go to this. Okay, so here are some pretty well established specialties of each side of the brain. The left side of the brain involved in analytical thinking. So when we're thinking through things logically, step by step, examining each of the details and facts, that's the type of thinking the left side of the brain does. Left side of the brain, also those language areas in most people as well. When we're doing science or math, the left side of the brain needs to get involved to a great extent because it does involve a lot of analytic thinking and logic. So the left side of the brain responsible for speech, also for calculating, and the left side of the brain thinks primarily in words. That said, the left side of the brain is very literal in understanding language. So if you use an expression like the person was big as a house, then the left side of the brain believes that you're telling them that the person was actually that large. The left side of the brain, as I mentioned, also seems to be the side which is responsible for coming up with explanations for our actions. Now, the right side of the brain tends to work in holistic thinking. So kind of rather than looking at the details, seeing the big picture, and therefore may be responsible for intuition. When we sort of know the answer to a question, but we don't exactly know how we arrived at that answer, this may be the big thinking, big picture thinking, holistic thought of that right brain, putting the pieces together. Right brain also very much active when we engage in creative activities. So when we're engaging in artistic or musical creativity, a lot of activity with the right brain. The right brain is also involved with perceptual ability. So interpreting perceptual information, visual spatial. So it thinks mostly in pictures rather than words. And it is inferential when it comes to language. In other words, infers the meaning behind the actual words. So the hidden meaning of the words. The person big as a house, oh, they were unusually large. That's what they really mean. Also, it seems to be the part of our brain that is involved with our awareness of self. They've done some experiments where they sort of put this side of the brain to sleep, and people will often have this experience of not being a distinct, separate individual anymore, but rather dissolving into sort of a all is one sort of feeling, but that sense of self returning once the right brain becomes active again. So a whole bunch of stuff. Now, we should also mention that most of the things we do actually involves both sides of our brain working together. And for that matter, you know, they might talk about people being a right brain person or a left brain person. Are there really people that only use their left brain? No. Or only right brain? No. We all use both sides of our brain, although some people may prefer the activities that are the specialties of the left brain or the right brain more, and spend more time with those sort of activities. That's true. And that also brings up the old thing that you probably have been told, that you only use like 5% of your brain or something like that. Yeah, you've probably been told that. Is that true? No way is that true. And I always like to tell people who say that, I said, well, which part of your brain do you think you can do without? And then they're like, oh, well, no, I don't think I want to do without any of it. And the fact is that as we've studied the brain, yes, we use all of it, although we may not use it all at one time. And maybe we could use it more efficiently or effectively, but how we use it all. Okay, so just let me finish off with just a little bit about behavior genetics. So this is the business of looking at behavior and psychological traits and how they might relate to a person's specific genetic inheritance. And so to study this, what they do is they look at people who are related to various degrees and look at concordance rates for various psychological traits. So as they look at this, they might compare identical twins with other brothers and sisters who are not quite as similar genetically, those with cousins, aunts, and uncles who are somewhat genetically similar, but even less so, and then finally more distant relatives as well as non-related people. So this helps us to sort out and to what extent does a person's environment contribute to various psychological traits and behaviors, to what extent does their genetic makeup. So one of the ways at getting at that is to do twin studies where we compare identical twins with fraternal twins. So identical twins we know have the exact same genetic material. Fraternal twins, you have of the genetic material that varies from one person to another, about half of it, 50% in common on average. So identical twins, much more similar genetically than fraternal twins, so we can then compare them on various traits. One example here, they compared identical twins with fraternal twins when it came to intelligence scores, found that the intelligence scores of identical twins significantly more similar than those of fraternal twins. Well, what's that tell us? Tells us that genetics do have a lot to do with intelligence scores. Although what they also noted is that there was significant similarity even amongst that of fraternal twins as well. So that suggested, yes, some genetic influence. We also may do comparisons of identical twins that are separated very early in life, maybe even shortly after birth. And so that can help us sort out what traits, behaviors might relate to environmental influences versus genetic influence. If the twins, identical twins who are separated, are just as similar as those who grow up in the same household, we can say, that kind of speaks more for genetics. If we find out that there is more difference in those twins that are separated than those that are raised in the same home, then that suggests that there's more environmental influence. Another approach to this is the use of adoption studies. So here, what we do is we look at adopted children and we compare them on some trait with their biological parents as opposed to their adoptive parents. Okay, so if the adoptive child is more similar to the adoptive parent, then that suggests greater environmental influence, greater nurture influence. On the other hand, if they're more similar to the biological parent, then that suggests more genetic influence of that trait, more nature. And just to give you a couple examples here, when it comes to personality, who do you suppose adoptive children are more similar to? Biological parents or adoptive parents? In class, a lot of students will say, well, I think probably there's more similar to adoptive parents. And I think I would have said that too before I learned what they actually found as they studied this. It turns out the personalities of adoptive children are actually more similar to those of their biological parents than their adoptive family. So suggests here that genetics has significant influence on personality, more so than one's environment. Now, that said, in looking at the same adoptive children, they noted that when it came to values, religious beliefs, those sorts of things, in that case, the adoptive children were more similar to the adoptive parents, less similar to biological parents. So different traits, different effects. Okay, so enough of that, plenty for one day. And so have a great day. I'm going to call it quits here. And there we go.